A little bit over 5 months ago, on February 9th, Michelangelo Antonioni's 1970 film Zabriskie Point celebrated its 50th anniversary. Zabriskie Point is by no means a perfect film. For one thing, the acting.
What the hell was that?
What do you mean, reality trip? Oh yeah, they can't imagine things.
Leaves something to be desired. However, Antonioni's controversial film about a young radical on the run from the police because he is falsely suspected of killing a police officer, who actually murdered somebody, only to be killed by a reckless police force, serves as a time capsule of the leftist countercultural movements of the 60s and 70s, and their treatment by police. A time capsule that has remained relevant for the last 50 years, and is especially relevant right now, in light of recent events. 3 months and 16 days after Zabriskie Point's 50th anniversary, George Floyd was murdered by Officer Derek Chauvin of the Minneapolis Police Department while 3 other officers stood by and did nothing. This incident is one of the more recent events on a centuries-long list of cases where police murdered, often unarmed, people of color and sparked a global protest movement against police brutality and systemic racism. In response to these protests, we have seen police sink to the moral low ground of the bottom of the fucking Mariana Trench as they attempt to maintain their power, beating peaceful protesters, spraying them with tear gas, shooting them with rubber-cased bullets, and driving their vehicles into crowds of protesters. In a time when we're once again witnessing the brutal conflict between police and leftist activists, I think it's worth exploring how Antonioni's film captured the same conflict between police and leftist counterculture 50 years earlier. A big part of why I think Zabriskie Point is so successful at capturing this conflict, and why it's so often described as a time capsule of the era when so many other films of its era just aren't, lies in how the film frames this conflict. While there were a score of films much more mainstream than Zabriskie Point that were about the same conflict between activists and police, such as Getting Straight, The Strawberry Statement, RPM, and even less mainstream and more controversial films like Medium Cool that came out around the same time as Zabriskie Point, most of these films are framed around outsiders to the movement getting caught up in the conflict and beginning to accept the activists, and are a lot less radical than Zabriskie Point. On the other hand, there are films just as radical as Zabriskie Point, but on the opposite end of the political spectrum. One such film is 1976's The Enforcer, the third film in the Dirty Harry franchise, and a film more mainstream than all of the mainstream films I listed earlier combined. Like the other films in the Dirty Harry franchise, The Enforcer is a film about Detective Harry Callahan, a fascist cop who isn't afraid to do what he needs to do, commit unnecessary acts of brutality, to get the job done, and who has become disillusioned with the modern state of law enforcement, not because it allows him to commit act of unnecessary violence after act of unnecessary violence, but because his superiors think that driving a squad car into a building before getting out, guns blazing, is perhaps not the best way to handle a liquor store robbery and hostage situation. The reason I'm using this film as an example and not the previous two films in the series is that the antagonist our hero cop is fighting in The Enforcer is a terrorist organization known as the People's Revolutionary Strike Force, who you know are supposed to represent far-left extremists because they have the word revolutionary in their name, and also because they're linked to a stand-in for the Black Panther Party. Obviously, the Enforcer's decision to frame the film around the snarky wish-fulfillment cop who has to take down a far-left terrorist organization whose members don't believe anything they say and are just in it for the money, instead of framing it around members of leftist countercultural movements and their struggle with police brutality, is a result of the film being a part of a larger franchise about a snarky wish-fulfillment cop. But it also pushes a pro-cop, anti-leftist counterculture narrative, even if Harry has a lady cop partner that dies at the end. This is what feminism is really about. More female CEOs and landlords, please. We can call them landladies and chief executive office hers. This'll fix everything. Another film that's just as radical in its politics as The Enforcer, but much more overt about it, is the 1972 educational film Brink of Disaster. In this film, our protagonist is a college student named John Smith, a very creative name, who breaks into the campus library to study while a riot rages outside. Johnny's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather from the 1770s shows up, explaining how he gave his life to build the United States, and how a bunch of radical leftists are now trying to destroy it, differentiating between the revolutionaries of his time and the revolutionaries of the 60s and 70s by claiming that the former group was devoutly religious while the latter group is not. I personally think that a much more accurate way of differentiating between the two groups is that the former owned slaves and the latter didn't, But that's beside the point. Dr. Hartman, Johnny's history professor, also shows up to parrot a variety of conservative talking points, such as how young people these days don't respect the contract of marriage.
Instead of love, honor, and cherish, as long as you both shall live, it's, hey, let's shack up, baby. As long as you please me sexually, or as long as you pay the bill. Or until someone else comes along that I like just as much.
Or how marijuana is a gateway drug that leads to heroin addiction.
Now, no one goes directly to heroin, but nearly everyone on heroin started with marijuana.
When the Students for a Democratic Society protesters, whom the film refers to as Students for a Dirtier Society, reach the library and begin breaking down the door, Johnny, who up until this point has been ambivalent about the protesters, threatens Dr. Hartman if he tries to stop them from entering. Luckily, 1770s John incapacitates modern-day Johnny, and the film ends with 1770s John and Dr. Hartman staring down the door that will soon give way to the violent mob behind it before the image freezes and a title card reads, "Will you let this be the end?" Brink of Disaster is a chillingly relevant film, but not in the way that it wants to be. Most of its arguments would not seem out of place airing on Fox News right now as a response to the protests currently going on. In fact, the best way I can describe it is that it's what would happen if Dennis Prager wrote and directed a short film that was executive produced by Tucker Tarleton.
Freedom of speech is now freedom of filth. All part of this freedom of filth. Filthy language, no decent person would speak. Filthy books and magazine, no decent person would read. And filthy movies and stage shows, no decent person would sit through.
That's why so much contemporary art is meaningless and involves the scatological, meaning urine and feces. Yes, urine and feces.
I bring this festered sore of a film up not because it is specifically about the conflict between police and countercultural activists, but because it showcases an attitude towards leftist student activists common at the time, especially among people with power. The protesters are just a mob of mindless rioters looking for something to burn, and intent on destroying the American way of life, and anyone who does so much as defend their right to free speech is on their side. While the film doesn't explicitly state that the police should use brutality against these activists, its call to action in the ending title card is a specific call for every patriotic, God-fearing, red-blooded American to do anything they can to stop leftist activists and protesters. Unlike these films, Zabriskie Point is not framed around a brutal police officer or vigilante that has to stop the far-left extremists from destroying America, or around outsiders getting caught up in the conflict and beginning to accept the activists. Zabriskie Point is framed around a countercultural radical and the adventurous spirit he meets on his run from law enforcement. While Mark probably isn't the most accurate depiction of a student activist, he walks out on the meeting at the beginning because he
just couldn't stand their bullshit talk. It really bored the hell out of me.
When it comes down to it, he agrees with their cause, and it's his and Daria's eyes that we see the conflict through. While Antonioni has said that his intention was isolating two characters and simply making an interior film about how they feel, this framing of it, as well as choices in shot composition and score that I'll touch on more later, make us sympathetic to a lot of the actions and beliefs of Mark and Daria than we otherwise would be. When the police officer shoots an innocent man and we see Mark reaching for his gun only for the officer to be shot before he's able to grab it, we know that Mark isn't the one that shot the officer. When Mark steals the plane, we know he did it to escape a police force that would otherwise wrongfully murder or imprison him. When Mark is shot returning the plane and Daria hears about his death on the radio, we sympathize with her loss and understand her emotional state and political awakening. This framing of the story around the countercultural radicals rather than the police is why Zabriskie Point is so often described as a time capsule of the era in which it was released, a time between the 1968 Orangeburg Massacre, the violent attacks of the Chicago police against demonstrators outside the 1968 Democratic National Convention that were broadcast live on American television, the infamous 1969 police raid of the Stonewall Inn, and the massacres at Kent State and Jackson State that took place only 3 months after the film was released. That being said, Zabriskie Point's framing is by no means perfect. The film's decision to frame the conflict almost entirely around white radicals means that it doesn't really acknowledge the disadvantaged minority groups that are disproportionately affected by police violence. Aside from just generally enhancing the film's focus on police brutality, there are a few scenes and plot points in particular I think would be much more politically biting if the film were framed around people of color. The first of these scenes is the scene in which Mark and his friend try to buy some guns to defend themselves against the police. They're initially told by the clerks that they'll need to have their records checked and wait 4 to 5 days before they can pick up their guns, until Mark tells them that they live in a borderline neighborhood and need to protect their women, to which the clerks respond by eagerly selling them a .38 caliber handgun and telling them tips on how to kill someone and get away with it.
One other thing about the law, it says you can protect your house, so if you shoot in the backyard, be sure you drag him inside.
Okay, thank you.
The joke of this scene is that the clerks are racist, and are hesitant to sell Mark and his buddy guns until they know they're planning to use them for racist vigilantism. However, if this film were framed around people of color, this scene, or another scene like it, could be a nod to laws like California's Mulford Act of 1967, which banned carrying loaded weapons in public, and was meant to target the Black Panther Party, who carried guns to defend themselves and other black people against racist police violence. The other part of the film I think would be more politically biting if it were framed around people of color, is the fact that Mark is on the run from the law for most of the movie because he is falsely suspected of killing a police officer. If this film were framed around people of color, this plot point could easily be about how black people are racially profiled and accused of crimes they didn't commit. To the film's credit, there are a few people of color in the film, such as the black students at the meeting Mark thinks is boring, who, to their credit, make some interesting points.
Y'all dealing with things that are really irrelevant. Because you going back to the same thing, you get busted for grass, and that makes you revolutionary. Now, when them pigs get to busting you on your head, so you're kicking down your door, stopping you from living when you can't get a job, you can't go to school, you can't eat, that's what makes you a revolutionary, dig?
The black student running out of a building and tucking in his shirt who is shot by a police officer, who is then shot, which Mark is wrongfully blamed for, and one of Lee's servants of native origin, who Daria makes eye contact with and smiles at in a gesture symbolic of her political awakening and newfound working-class empathy. Expanding upon a few of these characters, especially the second one, would allow the film to acknowledge how disadvantaged minority groups are disproportionately affected by police violence. While these criticisms about the film framing the conflict almost entirely around white radicals are important to keep in mind when bringing it up as a parallel to real-world police brutality, I wouldn't hold it against the film too much. As Antonioni himself said, quote, "My film touches on just a few themes, a few places. Somebody can say this is missing or that is missing. Well, of course it is. The story is certainly a simple one. Nonetheless, the content is actually very complex." Where Zabriskie Point fails, it fails with the company of most of the films of its time, and the majority of films today. Where Zabriskie Point succeeds in framing, it succeeds almost entirely alone, with a few exceptions like 1964's I Am Cuba. The way the film's narrative frames the conflict positions the police as not just the agitators, but as an inhuman, humorless group who are, in the minds of society, a class above that of our protagonists. This framing is apparent from the first moment we see the police in the film, aside from when Mark flips off the 2 motorcycle cops. The cop at the police station changes William Pollitt's identity at will to make him seem less important.
Occupation?
Associate professor of history.
That's too long, Bill. I just put down clerk.
And smugly dismisses him when he points out that some of the people there are badly injured.
Some of these people over here need medical attention.
You didn't say you was a doctor.
When Mark shows up to try to bail out his friend and asks him if there's anything he can do to help, one of the cops grabs him, violently swings him around, and slams him into the grated barrier. When another officer asks Mark for his name and he jokingly responds with Karl Marx, the officer not only doesn't understand that he's joking, he also spells Karl Marx's name with a C. This narrative theme of police brutality escalates at the student demonstration, during which we see a variety of shots of police beating protesters with nightsticks, shots of severely injured protesters, and shots of blood-soaked bandages and tissues covering the ground. This tension escalates even further when the police throw tear gas bombs into the school to force the students to exit, shooting a black man running out of the school because he was tucking in his shirt. When that police officer is killed and Mark is viewed as the one who did it, Mark realizes that his fate will be the same if he doesn't immediately get as far away as possible. The idea of the police being viewed as a class above that of our protagonists comes up in a conversation between Mark and Daria about news broadcasts concerning the strike.
Hear any news about the strike?
Not much. I prefer music.
It's getting like they don't even report it unless 200 or 300 people get hurt.
Yeah, some kind of record.
Or a cop.
Oh, a cop did get killed, and some bushes were trampled.
Not only does this exchange set up Daria's apolitical nature, it also highlights the tendency of the media reporting on the conflict to focus on a police officer killed or a few bushes trampled rather than the hundreds of protesters killed. A tendency still present in the corporate news media of today that focuses on condemning rioters and looters, vandalism of police vehicles, and protesters defending themselves against the police, rather than condemning the police's use of brutal, sometimes lethal force against peaceful demonstrators. This framing of the media's narrative within the film's framing highlights how the lives of police officers and the sanctity of private property are seen as more valuable than the lives of protesters. The narrative's theme of police brutality reaches its climax when Mark returns the plane and, in doing so, is shot dead by a reckless police force, who give no warning, more interested in protecting and returning this rich person's property than in protecting his life in the process. It is hearing about this event on the radio and the emotional state coming from it that spurs Dario's political awakening in the end of the film, as well as the film's absolutely stunning ending sequence. This focus on police brutality and this idea of the police as an inhuman, humorless group, who are a class above our protagonists, is also present in the film's visuals. I would argue even more so than it is in the film's narrative. When the cops at the police station change William Pollitt's identity at will to make him seem less important, it's not just a matter of one cop changing his occupation on the form. It goes along with the visual representation of another cop slowly removing parts of his outfit, handkerchief, fancy watch, glasses, and tie, with the effect of making him look more and more disheveled. The emphasis placed on the graded fence barrier between the teachers and students and the police symbolizes the police as a class above the citizens. This visual framing of the conflict between police and citizens gets even more overt at the student demonstration, during which the riot police are often shot from low angles or in the shadows, like villains. The uniforms they wear and the masks that cover their faces render them as an anonymous, homogeneous, and inhuman group with power over the protesters, who are shot at eye level or from above. Unlike the police, their clothes are all different, their faces are unobscured, and their many injuries are on full display. The camera's framing of this scene makes it clear who has power over whom, who is antagonizing whom, and who is attacking and injuring whom. But the police aren't the only antagonistic force in the film framed in this way. In the scene directly before the student demonstration, we see real estate executive Lee Allen in his office that gives off a sense of, to quote Donato Totaro's scene-by-scene analysis of the film, harsh, sterile, inhuman modernity. The entire office is juxtaposed with the very prominent American flag in the background, creating a connection between the US government and big corporations. The fact that this shot directly cuts to a close-up of a police officer at the student demonstration in full riot gear hammers home this connection between business, government, and law enforcement. Lee's office is in a skyscraper overlooking the city, and Lee is shot from a severe low angle framed around his crotch, making the scene a hyper-exaggerated version of the framings of the power dynamics at the student demonstration. While the way the camera frames the student demonstration makes it clear that the police have power over the demonstrators, the way the camera frames this scene makes it clear that business and government have power over the city. This scene is also an example of the recurring symbol in the film of altitude being a visual signifier of class. Rich businessmen are almost always shown in rooms up high in skyscrapers overlooking the entire city, whereas the activists are always shot on the ground. Antonioni alluded to this symbolism himself when he said, quote, "The executives in their towers, although so powerful, are actually solving idealized problems. Not the real ones, the ones in the street below, the ones they cannot even see. It is on that street level that we find the real conflict, between the rich and poor, black and white, old and young." End quote. The only time we see a protagonist framed in this way is when Mark steals the airplane, taking it to the desert and transforming the symbol of extravagant American consumerism into a symbol of counterculture. When Mark returns to society with this revolutionary vision, the police make him pay with his life. Like Totaro points out, this rebirth of the plane, to the point that Mark jokes about how people may not even recognize it when he returns it.
They might not even think it's a plane. Strange prehistoric bird spotted over Mojave Desert with its genitals out.
And the name of the location Daria is heading compare this repurposing of the plane to the death and rebirth of the Phoenix. But I also think that the combination of the symbolic use of flight and its tragic end has tints of the myth of Icarus as well. Where Saturn devouring his son fits into all of this, I'm not sure, but I wanted to use the picture anyway, so here it is. This social stratification is absent in the desert, where our protagonists are able to roam wherever, whether it's the tops of cliffs and sand dunes, or the valleys in between. This commentary on social stratification goes hand in hand with the film's critique of consumerism. There are plenty of moments in the film that comment on consumerism, such as the many shots in which billboards tower over our protagonists, or a lot of the samples used in the Pink Floyd opening track Heartbeat Pig Meat.
Motor manufacturers in these states report life expectancy for engines is double. Actually, codes are both a curse and a blessing in New York. Dry cleaners, their charge. When a Florida holiday on a TV.
However, I think the two best scenes that demonstrate this idea are the montage of billboards and logos 11 minutes in, and the Sunny Dunes promo 18 minutes in. In the first of these examples, we see the camera rapidly panning across various billboards, logos, and the industrial landscape surrounding them, accompanied by shrieking factory sounds, rendering the scene sensorially overwhelming. As Totaro points out in his analysis, the scene is fragmented between Mark, his truck, and the billboards, which communicates a feeling of alienation. The scene associates the overwhelmingness and alienation these stylistic choices communicate to the viewer with the consumerism the scene is depicting. In the second of these scenes, we see a boardroom full of businessmen intently watching a promotional video for a new housing development. The promotional video is made up of eerie-looking miniatures, giving it a purposefully stilted quality and making the contrast between the boardroom of businessmen and the idyllic yet stilted miniature housing community verge on comedy. Juxtaposed with this eerie separation of miniature and human is the separation of the desert and the housing community. The promotional video gives less a sense of offering rich people an escape to nature and more of a sense of rich businessmen imposing their ideas of structure and rigidity, especially ideas about the nuclear family, onto nature.
Become an independent man. Forge a life of your own, like the pioneers who molded the West.
You gals will really enjoy the fully equipped Sunny Dunes kitchen. Plenty of space for cooking for Junior and for that man of the house.
The desert orgy scene serves as a direct contradiction to these visions of consumerism. While the montage of symbols of consumerism and the urban landscape in which they reside is rapid, visually overwhelming, and set to loud shrieking noises that sound like a lost Roger Waters contribution to Ummagumma, I say this with love. The orgy scene is slow, deliberate, and set to calm, beautiful music by Jerry Garcia. While the Sunny Dunes promo sees eerie miniatures take the place of humans and rich businessmen impose their sense of structure and rigidity on the desert, the orgy scene focuses on very real and very nude human bodies, rolling and playing as they become one with the shifting desert landscape. While moments of eroticism in Antonioni's other films, especially his Alienation tetralogy, are plagued with feelings of guilt, misery, and dissatisfaction, a symptom of the emotional sickness of our times, the eroticism of the desert orgy in Zabriskie Point is carefree, beautiful, evocative of the countercultural idea of a return to free love and sexual revolution, and an antidote to the sick eros Antonioni's previous films depicted. But perhaps the moment in the film that best comments on the three thematic threads of police brutality, social stratification, and rampant consumerism simultaneously is the film's impressive and frenzied finale. When Daria arrives at Lee's desert estate in Phoenix, she wanders around this symbol of wealth and consumerism totally detached, like a ghost wandering through a house that was once theirs but has become unrecognizable to them. Throughout the scene, she is often framed looking through barriers, communicating the newfound sense of alienation she feels, and when she encounters the house's artificial waterfall, she begins to weep with it, melding her body with the waterfall and letting the water pour over her. Not only does the scene communicate her emotional state and the sorrow she feels for Mark's tragic and senseless end, as Totaro points out, it also uses the water as a symbol of purification and rebirth, to symbolize Daria's political awakening, once again calling to mind the symbol of the phoenix. This political awakening is made evident when Daria encounters one of Lee's servants of native origin, who she makes eye contact with and smiles at to represent her working-class empathy. After this interaction with the maid, Daria leaves Lee's estate, getting into her car and driving a short distance away before stopping, getting out of the car, and looking back at Lee's estate. It is here that the film's notorious and explosive finale takes place, in which we see Daria vividly imagining Lee's estate repeatedly exploding from various different angles and at various different speeds as this blemish of consumerism on the desert is reduced to a flaming pile of rubble and debris. In the following scene, we see a parade of consumer objects suffer the same fate, their solid identities being replaced by a kaleidoscope of psychedelic colors and shapes, accompanied by the Careful With That Axe Eugene adjacent Pink Floyd track, Come In Number 51, Your Time Is Up, and its relaxing instrumentals that give way to primal screeches and blistering guitar solos. While it's easy to see this scene as American consumerism getting what it deserves, and I think that's definitely part of it, the scene is also a representation of the anger at Mark's death at the hands of the police and the systems that allowed it to take place that Daria feels. These explosions rapidly cut back to a now smiling Daria, who gets into her car and drives off into the beautiful pink hues of a sunrise, representing a new beginning for her.
Dawn comes up so young, dreams begin so young.
This ending ties together the film's themes of police brutality, social stratification, and rampant consumerism, as Daria's sorrow at Mark's death at the hands of a reckless police force turns to anger at the systems that allowed it to take place, and the metaphorical rebirth of her political awakening. The takeaway is clear. These forces of unjust law enforcement, social stratification, and consumerism are all connected. The system that positions the police as a class above civilians, prioritizes the protection of property and repression of dissent, and allows them to commit countless acts of unnecessary violence, disproportionately against people of color, is the same system that allows for this social stratification. It's the same system that produces this excessive and alienating consumerism. It's the same system that the student activists at the beginning of the film were struggling against, and it's the same system we're struggling against to this day.